Hey, welcome to Navigating Charter Challenges, where we explore real life stories of charter schools facing tough issues and the people and partnerships helping them move forward. I'm John Carwell Jr., a charter school authorizer in Delaware and a longtime advocate for accountability, equity, and collaboration. Today we head to St. Louis, Missouri, where a charter school opened with high hopes, but quickly ran into academic, financial, and operational trouble. As the first charter in a historically low-performing district, the stakes were high from day one. When a school launches with weak infrastructure, unfilled classrooms, and an unprepared board, what do? Pull the plug or dig deeper to understand the root causes of distress? Today's episode highlights how Martha McKeon, Deputy Director of Monitoring and Accountability at the Missouri Charter Public School Commission, chose to lean in, focusing on identifying the root causes of distress and working closely with the school board to build real leadership capacity. What emerged was a story not of closure, but of course correction, a story of persistence, political awareness, and a belief that even deeply struggling schools can stabilize and succeed. Today's episode explores what thoughtful authorizing can look like when a school is showing signs of decline but still holds promise. We're talking with a statewide authorizer who helped one such school navigate a pivotal leadership transition and ultimately supported its reset under a new leader with roots in the local incubator, the Opportunity Trust. We'll discuss how Martha used a set of indicators of distress to move beyond compliance checklists and surface level metrics, and instead got to the heart of the school's governance challenges. It wasn't easy, but staying engaged made all the difference. So let's dive in. Let's meet Martha McGeehan and learn more about the context in which this school opened and unpack this story from the ground up. Martha, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, John. Happy to be here.
Yes, so let's dive in. Can you start by introducing yourself and your role as an authorizer in Missouri?
Sure. My role is with the Missouri Charter Public School Commission currently as the Deputy Director of Monitoring and Accountability. Prior to that, I worked in a university authorizing position. So have been in the authorizing space now for, 13, 14 years with the commission for the last 8 of those years. Um, the commission is the only statewide sole purpose authorizer in Missouri. And we have a pretty small staff. We're a staff of about 5. And currently we authorize 22 schools. And the other important piece of context to really understand Missouri is that currently, while there is growing flexibility in our statute. Currently, there are only charters in the Kansas City Public School District, and then in the St. Louis region in the St. Louis Public School District, and then the one that we're going to talk about today in St. Louis County. So we don't have statewide authorizing in terms of lots of schools across the state. We're really centralized in those 2 metropolitan areas.
Thank you, thank you. And just to dig a little bit deeper, what did your office look like early on and what led to your expansion from 2 to over 20 schools?
Yeah, so we were authorized by the legislature in the around 2015, opened our first school in 2016 in Kansas City. That was a scoop to nuts. They applied to us. We opened that school. That was a year prior to me joining the team. So our executive director was the only one in the office, opened that school with our board of commissioners. About a year later, we had another Kansas City school transfer to us from a university authorizer when that school was experiencing some pretty significant financial distress. And as part of their corrective action, were required to transfer to us to help stabilize the financial situation at school. Then over the course of about 4 to 5 years, the landscape in Missouri, most of the university authorizers have left authorizing for a variety of reasons. And as those authorizers left, schools were given the option to transfer to another authorizer, and most of them ended up coming to us. We have opened about 5 or 6 of those 22 schools ourselves, but the rest of our portfolio transferred to us from university authorizers. So we have a lot of schools who have experience with what it means to be authorized by a university, and then now what it means to be authorized by an authorizer who is only doing charter school authorizing.
Very helpful, and that's a really good segue to my next question, which is you've taken on portfolios from university authorizers that have since exited the space. So how did those transitions help your office's role and mindset?
Yeah, I think it caused us to get really clear about what we what we do and how we do it that's different than universities. So when we are having those conversations with schools about why they might transfer to us versus another university or a school district, we had to be very clear about what was the opportunity proposition if they came to us. What could we give them that they wouldn't get someplace else? Because a lot of the universities in Missouri were also their levels of support look very different in terms of they're providing professional development through their colleges of education. In some cases, they're providing financial support to these charter schools, so that their level of support looks very different than ours does as a sole purpose authorizer. So we had to be very clear as we were starting to have those conversations with schools that transfer to us about how we're different and how those differences we believe lead to higher quality seats for kids. And how by us staying in this lane of pure accountability versus accountability plus all of this other stuff could lead to better relationships with an authorizing office, as well as, like I said, higher quality seats for kids.
Very helpful. So that's a great description of your identity as an authorizer. Let's dig into the identity of the community. So this school was the first charter to open in its district and in one of the lowest performing districts in Missouri. So what kind of political and community dynamics were you navigating from the start?
Yeah, so St. Louis County is a really interesting space politically and in terms of the number of municipalities in the county. There are a lot of them, and in this particular district, it's like 20 some municipalities touch this school district in the county, and so they all have their own mayors, their own city councils, um, outside of the political district, the school board that also serves this district. So when navigating opening this school, we really had to be cognizant of all of those things. And again, since this was the first school to open in St. Louis County, there was a lot of unknown and a lot of political pressure in terms of are we, the argument that we hear a lot in the charter school space, we're taking money away from the public school district, and that's only going to make it worse. It's not going to help make the district better. So we had to navigate a lot of that. And it was not a friendly space to open a school, but we knew that the kids in that district deserved better options. And the district has been low performing for a very, very long time. And it was time to try something different other than just continuing to do the same thing, hoping that district would get better. So we did fight a lot of political battles, even before we could authorize or open this school.
Very helpful. So with all of the I guess spotlight on this first charter, the beginnings were not stellar. So when the school opened, what were the early indicators that the school was struggling, even before it opened?
Yeah, so even before it opened, they struggled to hit their enrollment targets. Um, if I recall correctly, they were shooting to open with 100 kids, kindergarten through second grade. And one of the reasons that they were having a hard time hitting that enrollment target was because the district, again, a unique little situation, had a kindergarten center. And families really liked the kindergarten center. So they were having trouble recruiting incoming kindergartners because that was part of, that institution had been a part of that community for a long time. The kindergartners were going to their own school, and families were comfortable and knew that space. Um, so they actually, in their early years, had a higher incoming class of first and second graders than they did incoming kindergartners. But still, they still struggled to really hit those initial enrollment targets early on. And so initially, we actually delayed their opening a year. because we saw that they really weren't going to have enough kids to be financially stable when they opened. So that was the first level of intervention that we provided for this school, was just saying, hey, it it doesn't hurt anybody to take a beat, give you another year to recruit kids. And again, this was coming right off of COVID too, and so there were all of those factors about trying to recruit when things are still slightly social distancing and all of that stuff. And so we're like, let's just pause, try for a really strong start, but give yourselves another year to get there. And so that was really where we first leaned in on this particular school and saying, we see some early warning signs that you're not going to have a really strong start. So let's do something about that. And that was kind of the first of many signs that we saw of distress in this school.
Very helpful. And how did your office's response evolve as you better understood the issues at play?
Yeah, so ultimately, once they did open, they also struggled to hire certified quality teaching staff. Again, it's a very tough district to work in, and so it was a very tough district to recruit teachers to work in. Um, they opened with at least two classrooms that were staffed by a full-time substitute teacher who is not certified in that grade level. So even though they finally hit their enrollment targets, they still couldn't hit the quality teaching staff that they needed. On top of that, while everyone going into this went in eyes wide open that these kids were probably going to be coming in very low, these kids came in academically even lower than any of us could have possibly imagined. And so lack of high quality teaching staff, students that are very far behind, even as 5, 6, 7 year olds, um, and the inability to really address those deep academic needs for those kids because the staff wasn't high quality. Um, and then, as the year progressed, we also started to see that the school leader, while she had really strong academic background and really strong roots in that piece, and so could lean into those classrooms and help, she was lacking in the organizational side of what it takes to run a school. And so they were having trouble with, contracts with their bus service and contracts with food service. There were lots of those just operational pieces that were falling through the cracks because she just didn't have strong experience in operations. And so those all kind of started to compound on one another. Um, and in year one, we give schools a lot of grace to, knowing that it's a startup. There's a lot of things that you don't know until you know it, and you're really in there running a school. I think all of us that have opened a school know that year one is very hard, even for the best of the best. So we gave that school a long leash. We gave them a lot of leeway, and we just paid a lot of attention to, like, all right, we see these things, but let's see how they respond and how they rebound. And then ultimately, when we saw their June 30 financials for that first fiscal year, they ended the fiscal year below the statutory requirement of a 3% fund balance, which is a very significant concern in the state of Missouri as a whole. And, as I think any of us who look at school financials know, that when you end a school year that low, it becomes very difficult to move forward and get out of that. So that was really the first time we were like, okay, we can't just watch and see if they can rebound from this themselves. We got to really lean in and figure out how to support this school, and work with them to figure out how to navigate all of these challenges that seem to be compounding themselves rather than getting any better.
Very helpful context setting for us. So, as you're looking at these different issues, what initially started as, low enrollment, you mentioned teacher quality, you mentioned leadership, operational. So, if we're using a medical model applying to this situation, you triaged around enrollment, but you discovered so much more. And I know that you have utilized WestEd's indicators of distress framework to move beyond the surface level problems to find the root cause. Tell us a little bit about your root cause analysis and the use of the indicators of distress framework.
Yeah, absolutely. That tool ended up being super helpful for our team, and in hindsight, probably should have pulled it out even sooner than we did. But really, once we saw this big financial issue, we as a team decided to circle up. Let's use the rubric, fill out the rubric for the indicators of distress, knowing that they've got some operational problems, they've got some academic problems, they've got some financial problems. But let's like use this tool that we have at our disposal to really see if we can identify if there is a root cause or if it is just these isolated um, problems that we then do have to attack differently. But doing that, we really dug deep into each of those individual problems and ultimately just decided where we thought we could have the most leverage and that would be able to approach each of those problems in a more uh, strategic way was really a problem with governance. The board was at the end of the day, they were the ones that weren't providing um, the right financial oversight of the school. They were the ones that weren't providing the right either professional development or evaluative structure or supervision to the school leader that then let these operational things get out of hand, as well as not holding her accountable to hiring high quality teaching staff. So once we used that indicators of distress and really could narrow down like, oh, okay, like where we can focus our most energy and still stay in our lane as an authorizer and not try and offer these like random supports in all of these other areas. Um, we really started to focus in on how can we support the board to solve this problem themselves with our support.
Very helpful. So, as you zeroed in on governance as the core issue, what actions did you take to support or guide the board?
Yeah. So really for us, it looked like having a lot of conversations with the board chair. And in those conversations, it was a lot of asking the hard questions and asking them, well, have you done this? Where are you on this? What is happening with this? And really asking the questions that they didn't even know they needed to be asking themselves, is really where we saw our role, and helping them navigate going from a startup board to really a managing and governing board where it isn't just about writing a great pretty proposal for a school, but you really your job now is to make sure this school is a viable school, and so helping them understand their role and where it was that they had control of these situations, and a lot of that really, like I said, it looked like a lot of talking. um, and, I think we often don't see that as necessarily an intervention. We didn't initially force them to do anything different. It was just really having those one-on-ones with the board chair, and asking really hard questions so that they started to think about what solutions they needed, and what conversations they needed to have with the executive director.
Helpful. And was there a mix up or transition of the board? Like when you mentioned the difference between a founding board and an operating board, were there some seat changes?
There initially there weren't any seat changes, and I think sometimes they also had a hard time. Um, I think this is probably a universal problem, right? Finding high quality board members is tough. And so they were still working with their, original board members. Most of them had been founding board members and they hadn't been able to replace those that had rolled off. And so they were also working with a smaller than ideal board. And they were missing some key expertise on their board. So that was again some of the conversations we had with them was how do you fill your board seats so that you have all of the support you need on the board in order to hold the executive director accountable to all of these things. Make sure you're managing and reviewing the financials in a way um, that sets you up for success and you don't end up at the end of the fiscal year with a fund balance that's too low. So we helped them understand what was missing from their board and how they might be able to address some of those gaps.
Helpful. So, how did you navigate the relationship building and the trust building? It sounds like those supports that you were providing, my sense is that I would be receptive to that because you're actually trying to help me. But, how did you mitigate potential defensiveness and not overstep your role from your position of power?
Yeah, I think part of that comes from, and in this case, this was a school that we opened. We authorized and opened ourselves. So we had been building that relationship since the application process. We are a very relationship focused authorizing office. We have regular check-ins with all of our board chairs, all of our school leaders when appropriate, and really see those relationships as a key part of the work. And I think that helps when there is a problem that arises, that we have already been having regular check-ins with board chairs and can call them and pick up the phone, and they're used to having conversations with us. And in this case, that was what happened. And so we really didn't navigate a ton of distrust from the board chair level. I think there was ultimately some distrust that came at the executive director level, and we can dig into that a little bit in a minute, I think. But um, because we're so focused on relationships from the very beginning of the authorizer relationship, I think it helps build that trust early on, so that when we do have to have those hard conversations, they see it from um, a place of support. I will say, like as we talked about earlier, a lot of our schools have transferred to us from other authorizers, and it's very hard to build that trust in those relationships in those cases where we're not working with them from day one. That takes a lot more work and a lot more talking, and different levels of support, right? How we can be transparently honest with them without um, being unkind, because we've also found that a lot of times when we are we feel like we're more transparent than some of the other authorizers have been with these schools. So we show up and we're like, whoa, you've got this big problem on your hands. They're like, well, no one else told us that. It's fine. We're like, you're the bad guy, not us. All these other authorizers have said we're just fine. And so those cases, those relationships are very hard to build. And we do have to kind of think through, we can't just walk in and show them the data and say, here you go, like look at this, look at how bad you're doing. We have to kind of approach that from the back door in some ways, to kind of have build the relationship, have those conversations, and then move it to the, okay, here's the truth, honest, transparent conversation about your data. So I think it's not a one size fits all approach, I guess, is the short answer to how we navigate the trust issue.
Very interesting. So I'm hearing a distinction between the charter schools that you, I'll say for lack of a better term, you birthed versus ones
Yeah.
that you inherited or adopted. So, but that's very helpful to hear the distinction and the nuanced approach that you have to take to meet the needs of your different charter schools. So it sounds like you have a very interesting ecosystem in St. Louis. So let's hear a little bit about your ecosystem. So enter the Opportunity Trust. How did that partnership come about and what made it the right fit for this particular situation?
Sure. So the Opportunity Trust within the ecosystem is a nonprofit organization in St. Louis, with the mission of really supporting increasing high quality educational seats in the region. Um, and those people that are familiar with, they're kind of the harbor master in the ecosystem, if you're familiar with that term. But really, their goal is um, doing whatever they can. They're raising philanthropy in order to support increasing high quality seats. So as the conversations with the board progressed, and as the board started leaning into their role and holding the leadership more accountable, the leader came to the board and ultimately said, I don't think I'm the right person to be the executive director. I would like to just be the chief academic officer. And this was in about October of year two. And initially the board said, okay, we'll make that shift. We need to, they started the thought process of how do we hire a new executive director. And in those conversations that we were having with them when they informed us that this was happening, our first push was for them to call the Opportunity Trust, because the Opportunity Trust also has a fellows program. They have funding to offer executive coaching and all of these other things, and could also support a search if needed. Um, and so, given that we knew that they had these resources and could lean in ways that we as an authorizer shouldn't and couldn't lean in, um, we really encouraged them to have those conversations, see where the Opportunity Trust could lean in. And ultimately, where that conversation landed was the Opportunity Trust had a fellow who had was in the process of working through her own planning to open a middle school. Um, and those conversations led to, why don't you take over this school, grow it into a middle school? You can start with, so you're not starting from scratch. You've already got the basics of, at this point, K through third grade. Uh, why don't you lean in? And she agreed to do that. Um, and with the support of the Opportunity Trust, they supported her executive coaching and her the transition of what that looks like. And it was not, I won't say it was an easy transition by any means. And ultimately, the original executive director decided to leave the organization altogether rather than stay as the chief academic officer, as one can imagine why that would happen. But given that using that partner in the ecosystem allowed the school to have supports and resources, again, that as their authorizer weren't appropriate for us to identify a leader for them or provide executive coaching to that leader, um, or provide professional development in all of those other spaces. But we could say, hey, Opportunity Trust, we see this problem. We're going to connect you with this board chair. Can you help them untangle this mess that they found themselves in, and identify which supports you ultimately can provide for them? So really, that was in our case worked out to be a really important piece of the conversation for how we ultimately moved forward with this school.
That's awesome to have that type of partnership available, not only to your office, but to schools as well. So, with regard to the new leader, what stands out to you regarding how the new leader approached the transition?
Yeah, so again, the original executive director had shared with the board that she didn't want to be the executive director. It was in the fall, and it was really probably early spring by the time they had identified this new leader who was willing to step in and really take things over. Um, but because she was in the fellowship program at the Opportunity Trust, she was getting paid already through this fellowship program. They really plugged her into the school in late spring so that she could um, evaluate all of the current staff early on to decide if they were the right staff to stay on. She could start hiring her own staff um, in that, the ideal hiring window versus having to wait until July 1st, or worse yet, what we've seen is a new leader comes in July 1st, um, has a really dysfunctional staff but can't do anything about it until the following March, and so you've already lost a second school year. um, she was able to lean in those last months of that school year to really build a strong team to start the next school year off on a better foot than they ended the last school year. She also had a really great network of her own that she brought and was able to bring staff to this district that wouldn't have otherwise been willing to apply for a job in this district because they knew her and they trusted her and they wanted to work for her. So I think that went a really long way in terms of how she was able to start the school year off stronger than just coming in on July 1 and figuring things out. But again, that required the school wasn't paying those dollars for those last 3 or 4 months of the school year for that leader. She was still being paid by the Opportunity Trust through the fellowship program that she was a part of. So that was a key piece that, again, we couldn't have done as the authorizer, but having those partners in the ecosystem and knowing who we could call to support these things was really important in terms of how we supported the school.
Interesting. And can you say a little bit about what was happening at the school during these transitions? So things like enrollment and culture, how was the community, um, I guess, continuing to be made whole or stay whole
Yeah.
while all these transitions were happening?
Yeah, again, it was not easy, as you can imagine, coming in as a new leader while the other leader is really still there. There were some cult, especially adult culture problems, as you can suspect, that were really tough to navigate. And ultimately, again, I think it was a lot of the executive coaching that was in place for the new leader, and helping them really stay focused on um, their vision, their goal, and try not to worry about all this other stuff that was happening. And we also, in our space, we're working with the board chair still to make sure that they were doing everything they could to make sure that the current year ended as strong as possible, and that they could provide some level of support to the current executive director to make that graceful exit once she decided that that was her decision to make that graceful exit and not make it um, a quite frankly a political nightmare. And there were times where it got close, but it was really from our seat. We had those conversations with the board chair about, have you thought about this? Have you done this for her? How are you supporting her so that she can finish strong even while this new executive director is starting to fill this role, so that it doesn't become toxic. And ultimately, I think the other thing that really helped that had nothing to do with us was that the new executive director brought in an almost entirely new staff. At the end of the day, that because the seats weren't all filled, and those that were filled weren't filled with high quality staff. Um, so in her very quick early evaluation of staff, she recognized that those that were there couldn't stay there. Um, so it was an interesting transition to say the least. And I think one of the things that we, people might be asking was it, why do this, right? Why not, when you see all of these problems, and you whiteboard it all out, like why even bother saving a school like this that starts off in year 1 and 2 with such significant problems? And again, that comes down to the political landscape that this particular school was in. We knew that if we closed this school, given how hard it was to open this school, it would be a very long time, if ever, that we could open another school in this community. And ultimately, that would be a disservice to the kids in that community and the families in that community. And we weren't willing to go down that road unless absolutely necessary, and unless we felt like we had tried everything that within our control that we could try. So again, I think we were having weekly check-in calls, sometimes twice a week check-in calls with this board chair, just to make sure that that transition was as smooth as possible, so that we didn't have to close this school and ultimately hurt the community even more than it had already been damaged by the poor performance of schools in that community.
This is really helpful to hear all of the context. So to lift up a couple of thousand feet,
Yeah.
the school to more of your office's role, to me, this story reflects a very mature, ecosystem aware approach to authorizing. So how did your thinking as an office, and your practice shift over time to get to this point?
Yeah, I think um one of the things that has probably shifted for us the most is really reminding ourselves who our relationship is with. And while there are certainly conversations that are really important that we have directly with a school leader, an executive director, CEO, whatever their title is, ultimately our relationship and our contract is with the board. And so we have really, in the last several years, been um, trying to be more focused on how can we support boards to have better schools. Um, and what is our role, given that that's who our contract with, that's the ultimate relationship with. What supports and what training and coaching can we provide for boards so that they can do their job well, that then leads to a strong school. Um, and that's not always easy, right? They're volunteers. Most of them have full-time jobs outside of running a school, and many of them have never been on a charter school board before, and that is a very different animal than serving on a lot of other boards. Um, and so that's, I think, the biggest evolution in our office has been, how do we provide those supports and the coaching to our boards so that they can be better and then ultimately impact the staff at the school so that they can be better. And the goal at the end of the day is high quality educational seats for the kids in our communities. Um, so yeah, I think that's kind of where we've put a lot of attention, is on the boards and not so much on um, piecemealing interventions, but really when we do see a problem, I can think of a handful of other examples where we provide the board with a range of options. Like we see the problem and then we come to the board and say, here's the problem that we've identified. These are the options that we think are in front of you in terms of how to address this problem. You, board, have the capacity and the autonomy to decide which road you want to take. That's not ours to tell you. Um, we'll help support you and help you find resources that can support whichever direction you decide to go. Um, but board, ultimately, it's your decision and your choice. And sometimes one of those choices is relinquish your charter and close. Um, but we try to be as transparent in those conversations as, yes, that's one option, but we think you could also try these other options. And only you can decide which is the right road for your community right now. So I think that's where our mind shift has really come into play when we're supporting struggling schools.
Understood. And um, as you've gone through this evolution, are there formal ways in that you communicate to schools and to partners about your current identity and your current process?
Um, that's a great question. In terms of formal ways, not a lot, right? We do have regular check-in conversations with all of our community partners. We try to, make sure that we're sharing with them what we know is happening in the ecosystem and they, hoping that they do the same because they're getting information from different places than we are. People tell them things that they won't tell us as their authorizer and vice, when it's the partner in the ecosystem is a funder, they'll tell us things they're not willing to tell their funder. So really, I don't think there's any necessarily formal mechanism, but it really, again, as we talked about earlier, is really through a lot of conversation and making sure that we build trust with those partners so that they see us as a really key part of the ecosystem as well, um, and want to continue to support our schools. And when we call them and we say, "Hey, we just saw XYZ happen in this school. Is this something that you can lean in on?" They trust that what we saw was real and important for them to lean in on. They don't see us as an alarmist. They don't see us as just picking on schools, or being the bad guy. We've spent a lot of time building those relationships so that when we call them and say, "Hey, we really think you need to lean in on this issue," we can't, but someone needs to. They trust that what we're telling them is the truth.
Thank you. And what I'm hearing is the investment of building that, political and social capital
Hmm. Yeah,
that we
very
have
important.
conversations. There's already been established a line of relationship, which is very important. So along those lines, what do you say to other authorizers who default to a compliance-driven model or think about closure as the first step when there's multiple red flags?
Yeah, I think I won't say that we are also not in a place where we closure is ultimately the decision that we have had to make. But I think we really want to identify if there are other options before closure. And sometimes, unfortunately, there aren't. And we truly believe that closure is an important piece of the puzzle and an important tool, and that closure can ultimately also lead to higher quality seats in a community. And we also recognize that closure is disruptive to kids and families and communities. So before we get to that decision, we really want to think through what are the other things we can help a board get to before we have to make that decision. Um, and I think that's the important piece is not just saying, oh my gosh, there's all of these red flags. There's no hope for this school. Um, but I think again, that's where the indicators of distress come in. And sometimes, again, the indicators of distress are meant to be an early warning sign, but I think they can also help when you've gotten a few steps past early warning to help identify the root causes, like we did in this case, um, it helped us really not just see all of these unrelated things happening, but really tie them together and identify where can we as an authorizer lean in that will address each of these unrelated problems. And so I would just encourage other authorizers to kind of step back and zoom out to again that 40,000 foot level, and see are there any threads that are connected? And if those threads are connected, can you lean in on that one thing, and will that help before you have to go to closure? And again, I think, as I mentioned earlier, some of the schools that, not the one that we talked about earlier, but some of our other schools, we really have said, we see a lot of problems, and you really, at this point, relinquishing your charter might be the best idea, or you can try one of these other two or three things, and we'll give you a little bit more time. Um, but you have to really lean into one of these other two or three things and do the hard work as a board. We can't do that for you. Um, so I think it's a lot of conversation. It's not just sending the letter that says you're doing all of these things wrong and bad, but helping them untangle that knot as well so that they can see where the root causes are.
Understood. And the value of having an objective thought partner with your eye on the ball in terms of what's best for kids. So in terms of what's best for kids, um, my next question is about like what would have been cause for you to pull the plug if using the medical model, if they didn't do X or these
Mhm.
set of things, then surrender the charter or we're coming after you.
Yeah, I think in the case of the school that we have talked about today, I think had they not been able to identify a new leader, and part of that new leader, that board, was we also required that they fill those empty seats on their board, and really bring in some more governance support. And I think, the first thing that we look at is a board's willingness to make those changes and make those adjustments. And if they're not willing to do that, then we're gonna push to pull the plug faster than we would if they're willing to at least try. And I think in this case, they were willing to try. They were able to identify a leader. They were able to fill their empty board seats, with some fairly strong board members. Um, so we were willing to see, give them until renewal to see if they could earn another charter with us. Um, and so far, things are moving in the right direction. We haven't seen an impact, we haven't seen their latest state assessment scores to know if it's had an impact academically. But organizationally, culturally, it's a completely different school than it was a year ago. So we do see those early signs of promise that the intervention worked. That's the other thing too. We pay a lot of attention to. It's not like we just say, okay, go do this one thing, and then we leave and don't come back and check in on them until our next evaluation. We really, once an intervention is in place, we're monitoring that pretty closely, and again, continuing to have those frequent checkpoints and conversations to make sure that the intervention is working. So again, I think I've said this several times today, but it really is about the relationship and about the conversations you're having with the board and the decision makers at the school level to make sure that what we did and the interventions and supports that we provided are making a difference before we just rush to closure.
Hmm. I'm thrilled about the success you and your team have had with this school. So, like when you think about maybe your personal values and your office's values, what are you most proud of and how your office handled the situation?
Yeah, again, I think it would have been easy. It would have been easy to not even open this school, to be honest. When we saw that they weren't able to hit enrollment, and rather than giving them another year to do their pre-opening work, it would have been easy to say, you know what, you guys couldn't figure this out. Maybe this isn't the right time to open a school in this community. And then when we saw the really hard things that were happening in year one, it in some ways closure is, again, I don't want to say that closure should ever be a first resort, but sometimes it's a lot easier to close a school early on than it is once they're established in the community. There's a lot of things going on. Um, and so I think from our values as an office, it really is about being transparent and honest, and also making sure that we're doing what's best for the community. And in this case, we really felt like what was best for this community was to give this school a shot, even when it was hard and even when we didn't think things were going in the right direction. But can we help them turn around in a way that is going to provide this community with a really important resource that they don't currently have? Um, so none of our decisions are real are made in a vacuum. It's thinking through um, not just the problems that we see, but where are the potential solutions, and how can we support a school in a way that helps them help themselves, um, is a really important piece of our work.
Awesome, awesome. This has been a very rich conversation. I'm curious, are there any other final thoughts you have regarding your experience with this school and its ultimate success, which has a lot to do with you and your office? Any other thoughts that of things that I haven't asked you about that you think the audience would be enlightened to hear?
That's a great question. Um, I think that, my really only ending thought is, I think sometimes as authorizers, it feels like there isn't a whole lot we can do to help struggling schools, and while still staying in our lane, and while still upholding a school's autonomy. Uh, but I think it's really important to think through the word support in a very broad sense of the word. And it doesn't have to be um, telling a school what curriculum they need to use, or telling a school that the curriculum is even the problem, right? But really helping a school. Um, for us, the support looked like having a lot of conversations. It wasn't telling anyone what to do. It was helping them figure out what they needed to do to solve the problem. And I think sometimes when we think about authorizing, it's hard to see how we can support schools. And I think in many cases, at least in my experience, that support looks very different school to school, and looks very different than kind of the traditional sense of the word support. And so I think that that's really one of the things that we're still continuing to learn ourselves in our office, and we have conversations about a lot. Um, what is our role in this situation? How can we do our job well? And what can we do to help this school help themselves?
Understood. Well, thanks so much, Martha, for the time. It's been a very enlightening conversation. I've learned a lot just by listening to this case. Even when we prepped for this, I'm still learning a lot just hearing us go through it again because I had some follow-up questions I didn't ask before. So thank you. We're once again, our podcast is navigating charter challenges. I hope you can get a lot from this as I have. And thanks for joining us.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.